Hello everyone, it's Miss Levy again, and we are here to do some review for Chapter 5, Key Issue 1. Key Issue 1 is where are language speakers distributed? And so when we look at this idea of world of tongues, we have the Earth's heterogeneous collection of languages is one of its most obvious examples of cultural diversity. So when you look at languages and the spatial distribution of these various languages and the connections within the trees and the families and the branches and the groups, you see that this is one of the most obvious examples of the cultural diversity of Earth, and that estimates are that there are between 2,000 and 4,000 distinct languages throughout the world. Many are in Africa and many are in South and Southeast Asia. So let's talk about language and communication. Language is a system of communication through speech. Many languages also have a literary tradition or a system of written communication. The lack of written record makes it difficult to document the distribution of many languages because they were only spoken, not written. So let's talk about countries and their languages. So countries usually designate at least one language as their official language. You can see that in Canada. Canada has two official languages in that it's English and French. And then they've also adopted some of the indigenous languages as well. A country with more than one official language may require all public documents to be in all languages. Adopting more than one official language is a way of appeasing minority groups, unifying the country, keeping the country together, and from breaking apart, where all groups feel honored and respected. The United States has no official language. They never adopted official language. The early settlers and then the founding fathers believed that we had been settled by immigrants, and so keeping with the spirit of the United States in our status of immigrants, they chose not to adopt an official language. Now, keeping in mind that the contemporary distribution of languages around the world results largely from past migrations of people. We will talk about language evolution and this process and how it actually occurs. So on the one hand, English has achieved an unprecedented globalization. English is widely globalized and widely distributed. It's the world's lingua franca, which is the language of money. So the world's language of commerce, the language of economics is English. So if you have somebody in, let's say, Southern Africa who speaks Swahili, and you have somebody in China who speaks Mandarin, the language that they will switch to in order to transact any kind of economic business elements would be English. The reason why English is so widely distributed is because, one, it's a language of money, and the United States is one of the richest countries in the world, and so that English dominated. It's because of colonization. The British colonized throughout the world and they took English with them. So English was a language spoken in so many different areas, from both of the Americas to Africa to Southwest Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia. And because of the global dominance of the United States, both politically and economically, and because it's the world's lingua franca, it led to the widespread distribution of English. But people are trying to preserve their local diversity in languages, and this global distribution of languages results from a combination of two geographic processes, interaction and isolation, which we'll talk quite a bit about. Let's talk about Key Issue 1, Origin, Diffusion, and Dialects of English. Please go to this PowerPoint. You find this this is on Google Classroom. Please watch this video about why people in the world learn English. So let's talk about the difference between standard versus official language. Official language means that it's a legally adopted language of the countries. Some countries have multiple official languages, like Canada and Switzerland. Some countries have no official languages, like the United States. A standard language on the opposite side here is a dialect that's well established and widely recognized as the most acceptable form of that language for government, business, education, and mass communication. The British received pronunciation. This is the dialect of the upper class Britons from London. This is the standard language form of British English. So this is the most formal of this speaking style. So official means legal, government. Standard means official, more formal, more sophisticated way of speaking. So let's talk about the Indo-European language tree and how English developed. And you see the Indo-European language family, you see this widely distributed throughout Europe. And then now globally, because of colonization, English is here in the Germanic branch. But you also see the Romance languages. They are widely distributed because these also from Italian, French, Spanish, they diffused because of colonization. Let's talk about origin of English in England. Okay, so here we have England. And this is where English originated. And the Celts were the group who were originally there. And they existed in isolation. So this is where you have this Celtic languages like Gaelic and Cornish and Welsh. Then they were invaded by the Germanic groups, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and around the 5th century, so around the 400s. They invaded, and these different groups conquered and settled throughout Britain. You can see that these Germanic tribes were originally from Denmark and part of northern Germany. And once they invaded, they then blended with the Celts who were there, and then they were isolated. So then they have the same process that they have new words for new phenomena, new physical features, new plants, new animals, new physical environmental features, and then the language begins to evolve and change. And so this exists in isolation until the Vikings came from Norway in the 9th and 10th century. They tried to invade. They failed, but they left behind many of the people. So this is where we get words like reindeer. So again, these people settled here. They begin to blend with the language that was already in existence there from the Celts and the Germanic tribes. This is why, because the Germanic were the first ones to really come and conquer, this is why we're in the Germanic branch. So then you see this influence of the Vikings from Norway. The language blends. We continue to have evolution of language with new words, new experiences, new phenomenon, new plants, new animals. Then the Normans with William the Conqueror, they invade in 1066. They bring French with them, and because they conquered, they made French the official language of Britain for 300 years. And but many of the common people, they resisted that because they weren't educated. But French then did begin to blend with the language. And that's why we have words like cafe in our English language. Because again, once you have this, then you have this isolation and you have the French influence here. So now you have the influence of the Celts were here beginning. Then you have this influence of the German groups, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, and they blend and they create new words. Then you have this influence coming down from the Vikings, and they bring their language, and this begins to blend and evolve, and then you have this isolation, new words, new experiences, new plants, new animals. Then in 1066 you have the French who come up, and they influence this language that was in existence there. And then you have new experiences, new words, new plants, new animals, new physical features, and the language continues to evolve. Then you have, at the same time, many traders and religious leaders and soldiers who were migrating through and traveling through, and they were also bringing words and languages and blending. So this is how we got to the language of English as it existed prior to colonization. And so once there was settlement. So in 1607, Jamestown, they set up in Jamestown, Virginia. Then in 1620, Plymouth, Massachusetts. Once they set up these two colonies, they brought English with them, as it was at that time. So it's almost like a snapshot in time. They travel from England, that's English at that time. And then they're isolated. They have very little interaction with the people from the from their original homeland because of the distance and the difficulty of travel. So now they're isolated. Then you have Spanish explorers, French explorers, Native Americans who are already there. And these people are all trying to communicate with one another. So then the languages begin to blend so that they can communicate. Same time, they have new words for new experiences. And so the language continues to evolve and change. And at the same time, you'll have influence of migration from Russia and other European countries. Again, the language continues to evolve and change. And over time, they continue to have new experiences and new words from this migration and isolation. And this is how we get to the dialect of English in America being so different from English spoken and the dialects in Great Britain, from Scotland, from Ireland, from South Africa, and from Australia. Because of this influence, this migration, this isolation, and then the blending with other groups. That's why we call an elevator an elevator and they call it a lift, or we call it an umbrella and they call it a brolly. It's because those words would have existed after that initial, they would have been created after that initial migration and while there was isolation. And so let's look at these English-speaking countries throughout the world. There are over 40 countries where English is the official language. Many of these is because this is where Britain had colonized. This is also where you will see Protestantism of Christianity, which the British were. This is where you will see that Protestant element of Christianity also influencing. And so let's talk about the differences in dialect. Dialect means that there are differences in the way words are pronounced, the spelling of words, the vocabulary, the actual words themselves are different, and the speed at which they speak. So dialect, the way that language evolved is the different dialects would be as language is continuing to evolve and change prior to there being two separate languages. This is as you see those the differences in interaction. They exist because of new experiences, new objects, and the influence of other languages, and because of isolation. And you see this depending upon where the original people came from Great Britain, and then where the people, they were influenced in the United States by the Dutch or the Germans or by the Russians, then that's how we get different dialects in the United States. So this is where you get these different dialects in terms of how people speak and where it's spoken. So it really depends on where the original settlers were from, and then from whom they were influenced. You can see this is the dialects in the eastern United States. Again, this has to do with the origin of the people who had come to the United States. And so words that were once regionally distinctive are now national in distribution. That's because of mass media and television and radio and the influence of the adoption of the same words throughout the country. And so when you look at regional pronunciation, this is where you get these this called an isogloss. And this is a word usage boundary. So for example, this is the boundary between where one person would call a Coca-Cola a pop in the Midwest, and a soda in the Northeast, and a Coca-Cola in the South. That boundary of that word usage is called an isogloss. It's also the boundary between people would say all of you and then y'all. That boundary is called an isogloss. So you can see like Coke, pop, soda. This is where people call it a pop. This is where people call it a Coke, and this is where people call a soda. And that boundary between that word usage is called an isogloss. And then you start to see these minor dialects as they develop today. Again, this has to do with the influence of the people who were originally here, and then the people who then subsequently migrated and came, and then the isolation. All right, guys, that concludes our review of 5.1.